Hello friends, welcome to part 2 of my Ever Cosplay adventures. If you missed part 1 where I made the chemise, I will link the video in the description below and leave a card if you want to check that out. Otherwise, let's dive into making Danielle's work dress. This is the dress Danielle spends most of the movie in, and while by far the plainest of all her costumes, is no less iconic. Historically, this dress would have been made from either wool or linen, and while we don't know exactly what the costume in the movie was made from, I'm going with a medium weight linen in a tealy blue color. So first off, we have the supportive underbodice. I will admit I overthought this way more than I should have. None of the patterns I initially found matched the design of the costume, and it's not actually a historically accurate design. The supportive garments of the early 1500s were known as a pair of bodies and were the precursor to corsets. Danielle's underbodice is closer in shape to the short stays of the Regency era. Kind of. Ish. So I waffled back and forth on ideas. Do I use my short stay pattern and adjust it? Do I use a Ren Fair type pattern and mess a whole lot of things around? And then I stumbled upon McCalls M7763, which is Angela Clayton's Renaissance dress pattern. And looking at it, I realized that if I broke down the pattern pieces, ignored the fancy frippery, the bodice pattern was exactly what I needed. I made a quick mock-up, couple of quick adjustments, and was ready to tackle the main fabric remarkably quickly. The underbodice laces up at the sides, so both the front and back are cut out on the fold. I left my mock-up without seam allowance, so I mark out the seam lines before cutting. We also need a bit of stiffening, so I added a heavy canvas as interlining. This I cut out without seam allowance to reduce bulk, and the raw edges of the fashion fabric will fold over and hold it in place. I basted the interlining down to prevent shifting. The only actual seam in this garment is the shoulders, so I pinned both sets together at their seams and stitched them together. And yes, while I hand-stitched my chemise, we're going for movie accuracy, not historical accuracy here, so machine it is. Danielle's underbodice has some kind of pattern on it, and it's possible it was a different fabric, but it's also possible that it was quilted. Quilting was a historical method of adding structure to a garment, so that is what I went with. I bought a handy-dandy quilting ruler, which has already more than earned its keep, and marked all my lines, first one direction, and then pivoting to make diamond shapes. While I had originally planned to only quilt the one side and then add the backing material, I realized I would get a better fit if I quilted all 3 layers together and then bound the edges. Then began the long, and I mean long, process of quilting all the lines. This is the main reason why I brought out my machine for this project. I love hand sewing, but I did not feel like quilting all these lines by hand. Lines complete, I cut some straight edge binding from the same linen. Straight edge binding was more historically accurate than bias binding, uses way less fabric, and since this was mostly straight lines, wasn't going to pose a fit issue. Then I pinned it on and stitched all the way around the outer edge and neckline. I folded the raw edges under to the wrong side of the bodice and stitched it in place by hand. Then I marked out the eyelet holes on each side. I used some silk thread for binding the eyelets and made them by hand, since fellow eagle-eyed costumers pointed out that they did use historically accurate hand-sewn eyelets in the movie. The underbodice will get laced up with some braided cord, and we're ready to start the bodice. I used the same pattern for both the underbodice and the bodice, with a couple of tweaks. This has a slightly different neckline from the underbodice, and we have to take the fit of the underbodice into account. So I made a quick mock-up of the bodice and was quite happy with the fit with just a minor adjustment to the side seam. The back of the bodice gets cut on the fold, but the front gets cut in two pieces. In the scene where Danielle is getting changed, we can see that her bodice is lined with a white material, no doubt for a bit of stiffening and structure. I used the same heavy canvas that I used for the underbodice, again skipping the seam allowance to reduce bulk. Then assembly begins. Since the bodice opens in the front, we have the shoulder seams and the side seams to take care of. I pinned in the canvas and then folded under the raw edges to secure everything. I finished all the edges by hand to prevent stitches from showing on the outside. Before I finished the center front edges, I wanted to double check the fit to know how much I needed to take in. To do this, I tried on the underbodice and the bodice together. That's when I realized that the neckline of the underbodice came in a little too far and was noticeable in places that it shouldn't be. Thankfully, this was a relatively minor fix to get it looking right. I carefully trimmed off the binding right along the stitch line and rebound the neckline along this new wider edge in the same way as before. I wanted the center front of the bodice not to buckle and warp when tied shut, so I added some synthetic whalebone along the front edge. I don't know if this is historically accurate or not, but again, we're aiming for screen accurate, historically adequate. I wasn't too worried about the stitch line showing here, as I knew it would be covered by trim later. Then I folded the raw edges under and whip stitched them into place. Danielle's bodice has a trim around the edges, which is a dark brown or black with a little bit of gold. I couldn't find a trim that felt right. Everything felt too modern or cheap looking, and I was short on time. So I found a variegated yarn and braided it with a bit of gold embroidery floss, and stitched one line all the way around. I was happy with how it looked, initially. But the more I looked at it, the more I was second-guessing myself. It looked okay, but it also felt incomplete. But that could have just been that I was looking at it at 11 o'clock at night and I needed to, as they say on the internet, use the sleep. But that nagging feeling was still there when I woke up, so I decided to get some audience participation. Was one line of braid enough, or should I add the second strand? And the response was unanimous. Add the second braid. So I did. And I am so glad I did. It instantly looked better with the second row stitched on. With the bodice complete, I could tackle the skirt. From what I could tell from the reference images, this is just a straight rectangle pleated to the waist measurement. I used 3 yards to get the drape and necessary volume. And for the vertical cut, I drew threads to make sure the cut line would be even along the weave. While drawing threads for vertical direction is fun, I really wasn't a fan of the idea of doing that for 3 entire yards of hem. Plus, any slight variance could be masked when I hemmed the skirt. So for this part, I embraced my inner Rachel Maxey floor troll, marked the length I needed with a yardstick and chalk, and cut it out with a lot less finicky fuss. A wide hem gives a nice bit of stiffness at the bottom, so I folded the hem edge up by about 2 inches and folded the raw edge underneath. It's way easier to hem a long piece like this when it's still a rectangle, instead of after it's seamed and pleated. I didn't feel like pulling out my machine for just one seam, so I joined the vertical edges by hand, leaving 8 inches open at the top to make it easier to get into the dress later on. Then I set about pleating 3 yards of fabric into a waist's worth of fabric. I had overthought this part too, trying to figure out where I should pin it to the bodice to overlap enough, but where was the actual center back going to be, which side am I pinning to which part of the bodice. But then I realized, okay, just pleat the skirt down, worry about attaching it to the bodice later. I used my machine to stitch all the pleats into place and then tried it on, only to realize I had slightly miscalculated somehow and I needed to make the waist even smaller. A bit of finagling and it was ready to go. I figured out where the skirt needed to sit to work with the bodice and then stitched them together. This was so satisfying. The closure is kind of complicated, so let me sum it up the best I can. The bodice itself closes center front with 4 ties. Easy enough. The skirt, however, closes just offset to center front, which we can see when Danielle is changing to the court dress. This posed an interesting challenge, but I did eventually figure it out. That open split I left on the skirt seam, I wanted about 6 inches off to the left, with enough room to overlap the skirt slightly where it joined. So I needed to offset it on the bodice. This was kind of nerve-wracking and felt totally wrong not to have the edges match up, but once the dress is finished, it will all make sense. I wanted to keep bulk at the waistline to a minimum, so I bought some wide herringbone tape and used that to cover the raw edges. I hand-stitched it into place, taking care on the top edge to only catch the lining and not the outer fashion fabric. For the raw edge of the skirt that was sticking out, I turned the raw edge under twice and whip-stitched it into place. For final fastenings, I put bars and eyes on the bodice and skirt at the center front, where the skirt seams overlap, and one last one halfway between the 2 pairs for extra security. Lastly, for the dress, I marked out where the ties would go, made some quick braids out of thick buttonhole thread, and fed them through to the center front edge. All that's left to do now is the tie-on sleeves. And of course at this point I hit a very common roadblock, which is when I reach the 90 to 95% complete stage on a project and my brain goes, no, I'm good. Let's move on. So I procrastinated working on these and in fact didn't finish them until the same afternoon that I shot the reveal. I treated these sleeves like gauntlets or bracers, first making a basic paper pattern using the measurements of my bicep and forearm respectively. And I remembered to take these measurements while wearing the chemise, since the volume of fabric would have to be taken into account. After the paper fit well, I cut them out of a thick fabric for a mock-up. Satisfied with the fit, I jumped into cutting out the linen. This is the same fabric as the dress, and I was able to use the leftover cutoff from the skirt. To add a bit more stability to the sleeves, I cut out an interlining from horsehair canvas. To minimize bulk, the only place I cut out seam allowance was on the seam line of the upper sleeve. The top and bottom edges will get the linen folded over it and will be held in place when finishing the raw edges. The lower sleeve has ties at the top and bottom, so there isn't actually any seams in this piece. So I simply folded the edges in, placed the second piece over top, and folded the edges in to match. Then I whip stitched all the way around. For the upper sleeve, I couldn't see any ties on the original. It looks like it's just a continuous tube. So I pinned one piece of linen and one piece of horsehair canvas together for the underside, and for the top, stitched a linen layer as one. I pressed and stitched the linen and horsehair down and did a rough whip stitch to hold it in place. Then I covered it with the other linen layer. I folded under and pinned the raw edges like with the lower sleeve and whip stitched it the same way. Then we need eyelets to hold everything together. I marked out all the placements and used silk thread to bind them. I used the same braided cord as the front ties for lacing the sleeves, and it was really finicky cutting out all the little pieces to join the sleeves. Especially when I did my math, knew how many I had to cut out, and then realized that that number was just for one sleeve. The top edge took me a while to figure out, and I was low-key kind of dreading it the entire time I was working on this project. You see, there are no visible eyelets on this bodice. That would have been too easy. So I was going to sew a hook loop kind of thing on the inside. However, I also wanted the option to wear the dress with the sleeves or without the sleeves, since Danielle spends a good chunk of the movie without the sleeves too. And I didn't want to have to be picking at knots, since I knew they would inevitably end up super tight. At the last minute, I came up with the idea to put metal hooks on the underside of the bodice and make little loops in the top of the sleeve cord to catch onto the hook. This gave me the best of both worlds with minimal headache. And there we are, Danielle de Barbarac. I am delighted with how it turned out, although there are a couple of little bitty adjustments I'm going to make in a couple of places for the next time. The cording on the underbodice keeps slipping through the eyelets, so I'll probably add a bead or something on the ends just to make sure they stay laced up. I also feel like maybe making a couple of the top sleeve ties a little shorter so that there's more tension on the sleeve. I kind of felt like they kept slipping down as I was wearing them, but that could just be me. Time for analysis. Is this costume historically accurate? Yes and no. The silhouette does match a lot of artwork from the early 1500s, but while there are a couple of surviving late 16th century stays that look kind of like Danielle's underbodice, every single one of them is longer in the torso than what she was wearing, and all the references I could find were a good 40 to 50 years after the Ever After timeline. If anyone can find a historical garment that matches, please let me know. I'm very curious. Now, does the underbodice work as a support garment? Yes, it does provide some support, but I'm not relying on it as the sole support in the way that I would, say, a Victorian corset. It is comfortable, even when fully laced, and it does its job pretty well. Would this have been practical for a servant, presumably getting ready by herself? No. I mean, I'm assuming that Paulette and Louise would have been busy getting themselves ready, so they wouldn't have been able to do up Danielle's lacing. So having that double side lacing plus the laces on the lower sleeves, really not practical if you're getting ready on your own. It was a team effort with my mom to get laced into the dress, which is saying something because I can get into my Kaylee Shindig dress 100% solo. But overall, this was pretty straightforward and very fun to make. I love how it looks, and my childhood self is going, yes! I can't wait to take it to Ren fairs and Comic-Cons. It is really comfortable, although maybe not for full summer heat. There's a ton of mobility, and for my first attempt at a Renaissance era dress, I'm giving myself an absolute win. I also kind of want to try making a history bounding version using the same pattern, but a simpler top and maybe a slightly shorter skirt for everyday wear. Early 16th century is a new silhouette to me, and I really like it. But while there are a couple of late survival.
Yeah, try to smile a bit. You look very grumpy.
I'm stealing my horse. This is the. Stay. We got it? We good?
Yep, we're good. Oh, now step off.